Mr. Edward Whitmore lived in the quietest room of Rosefield Care Home, a place nestled in the English countryside. At 85, his days passed in echoes of a time long gone. His only companion was an old, worn journal. Every morning, almost ritualistically, he would open it and write, page after page, line after line, all carrying traces of Margaret, the love of his life. She had passed away years ago, but Edward kept her alive through words. Their little home in Brighton, the tea they shared on rainy mornings, the silence they embraced on seaside, walks every moment, resurrected itself within those pages. His journal wasn't just paper and ink. It was the only place where she still lived. Edward's room was small but tidy. From the window, he could see the garden. In spring, he'd sit by the glass with birdsong floating through the air as he wrote. But even spring felt quieter now. Living, he believed, was equal to remembering, and memories, like seasons, eventually faded. Life at Rosefield moved on with a calm rhythm. Wake-up bells, lunchroom chatter, silent evenings. Edward had grown accustomed to the routine, though not content with it. While others watched television or dozed in armchairs, Edward returned daily to his journal. The book contained everything: Margaret's laugh, the smell of her scarf, even her famous lentil stew recipe. One morning he turned to page 17. It was about a summer they'd spent in Cornwall. A photo, slightly faded and curled at the edges, was still tucked into the page. Margaret smiling into the sun. Edward squinting awkwardly behind thick glasses. He stared at it long, breathing in phantom sea air. He remembered her voice. "Edward, look at that seagull. Looks as serious as you." He smiled. Perhaps memory was the only reality we truly owned. That evening, his neighbor Mr. Collins, a quiet widower, had left his door ajar. A soft tune drifted into Edward's room. An old Ella Fitzgerald ballad. "They can't take that away from me." Edward paused. He closed his journal. Some moments weren't meant to be written. Some were just meant to be felt. That night he wrote only one line. Even if a song ends, what we lived within it never fades. The garden of Rosefield was Edward's sanctuary. On good days, he'd walk slowly with his cane and sit at the furthest bench, where the breeze was calmest and the trees whispered to each other. He believed every tree had a memory, and every rustling leaf was a page being turned. One crisp morning he took his usual seat. The sky was gray, the wind gentle. His fingers traced the edges of the journal before opening to a fresh page. He hesitated. The first sentence was always the hardest. Then he wrote, "Margaret, today the wind feels like you, soft on my skin, deep in my bones. Spring may be returning, but in me it's still winter." Not long after, Mr. Henry Collins approached slowly, cane in hand. He sat beside Edward. Silence settled between them, the kind of silence that didn't need to be broken. "Writing again?" Henry asked. "If I don't," Edward replied, "I forget who I am." Henry nodded. "I just speak to her. Every morning. Not to her photo, to my heart." Two old men, two broken clocks ticking together. That afternoon, Edward wrote, "The older we get, the fewer people remain. But those who stay become precious, like the last leaf that clings." Even when winter comes, later that day, as he turned to leave the garden, a flock of birds flew up all at once. He closed his eyes and remembered a picnic decades ago, when Margaret scattered crumbs to sparrows. They had taken off in the same way. That day, she had whispered, "Life is like that. It begins together, ends apart." He didn't write that memory down. He simply kept it, like a pressed flower in the mind. Back inside, Nurse Emily asked, "Did you write something beautiful today?" "I wrote a bit of silence," he replied. She smiled gently. She didn't understand it, but she felt it. One winter morning, Rosefield welcomed a new face, Clara Westwood, a 27-year-old postgraduate psychology student. She was doing research on memory and emotional continuity in aging. Clara was warm, observant, and genuinely curious. She heard about Edward from Nurse Emily. "He doesn't talk much, but he writes every day," Emily explained. "His journal is something else." Clara knocked on Edward's door. He looked up from his writing. "I'm Clara," she said kindly. "May I sit with you a while?" He gestured to the chair across from him. "If you want silence, you'll find plenty here." In the following days, Edward began to share. He read aloud from his journal. Clara listened, not as a researcher, but as someone standing on the edge of someone else's ocean. "You should turn this into a book," she said one afternoon. Edward gave a faint smile. "I didn't write to be read. I wrote so I wouldn't disappear." But a seed had been planted. Clara began to scan his pages, her hands treating each one like fragile parchment. Edward, too, began to feel lighter. Someone now held his past with care. One day she asked, "What line means the most to you?" He replied softly, "If I can still see you when I close my eyes, then I'm still alive." She wrote it down. And later, Edward added this to his journal. "Someone listened today, and I realized my words were never alone. They just needed someone patient enough to hear them." Time continued to wear its soft edges on Edward. He moved more slowly now, but still he wrote. Clara visited regularly. The bond between them had deepened. It was no longer about study. It was about presence. One morning, Edward sat by the window, the journal in his lap. "I think I'll write my last page today," he said. Clara nodded. She knew what that meant. He opened the book and began. "Dearest Margaret, 6 winters have passed since you left. I wrote to keep you near, to remember. But I never forgot, because you are the ink that fills my veins. If we ever meet again, I will simply say, 'Waited,' and you will understand." He closed the book. Outside, clouds moved slowly across the sky. He rested, a small smile on his face. The next morning, Clara arrived early. Nurse Emily met her at the door. "He passed in his sleep," she whispered. "So peaceful." Clara walked to the room. Edward lay still, the journal across his chest. A dried rose petal lay beside his hand. Months later, Clara published a book, The Silent Journal of Time. It wasn't just her thesis. It was a legacy. The book resonated deeply. One elderly reader wrote, "I've started my own journal, because if someone reads it one day, I will still exist." Edward's story had ended, but his words began to live in others. Months had passed since Edward Whitmore's quiet departure from Rosefield Care Home. Life there had returned to its routine rhythm, yet something lingered, a trace of him that still lived in the corners of the garden bench, in the scent of old books on the shelf, in the soft hush of early mornings. But in one room, Edward's journal remained, no longer closed, but open to the world. Clara Westwood, now a published author, had taken Edward's story on a journey far beyond either of their expectations. The book, The Silent Journal of Time, had found its way into libraries, hospitals, universities, and even prisons. It became a whisper of comfort for many who feared time would erase them. One spring afternoon, Clara returned to Rosefield for the first time in weeks. She wasn't a student anymore. She was now a speaker, an author, a messenger of someone else's quiet legacy. She brought with her a new copy of the book, bound in navy blue cloth, and handed it to Nurse Emily. "For the library shelf," she said with a smile, "so no one here is ever forgotten." Then she stepped into the garden. The bench where Edward used to sit was still there. Now, under blooming cherry blossoms, Clara sat down and closed her eyes. The wind carried soft fragments of memory. Edward's voice, reading aloud. Margaret's name spoken like a prayer. The rustle of pages turning. She opened her own small notebook. "Today I return to where it all began. Not to mourn, but to remember. Because memory is not a place. It's a person, a voice, a pause before the final page." Edward never truly left. He simply turned the last page and became part of every story that dares to be written. As she finished writing, a young man approached. "Excuse me," he said shyly, holding a worn copy of her book. "Are you Clara Westwood?" "I am," she replied warmly. "My grandmother asked me to thank you." She started writing again. She says she remembers who she is now. Clara's eyes glistened. Then Edward's journal did exactly what it was meant to. The boy nodded. "Would you mind signing this?" She smiled and took his pen. Before writing her name, she paused, then added a simple line beneath the title, inspired by Edward Whitmore, who proved that even silence has a voice. And so the journal lived on, not just in pages, but in pens, in people, in the quiet courage to tell our stories before the silence claims them.